A millionaire found a young girl sleeping in the barn of his farm and took her inside the house. Several days later, the millionaire was shocked to see what the girl did to his wife, who was in a coma. The haunting melody of Moonlight Sonata drifted through the empty halls of Hayes Mansion, its notes carrying both beauty and desperation. In the dimly lit music room, 8-year-old Margot Anderson's small fingers trembled across the worn keys of an old piano, her tear-stained face illuminated by flickering candlelight. Behind her, the shadow of an imposing figure loomed larger. "So, you thought you could hide this from me?" Thaddeus's voice cut through the music like a knife. "Just like your mother, always sneaking around, always hiding things." The final note hung in the air as Margot's hands froze over the keys. The sound of breaking glass shattered the silence as Thaddeus hurled a bottle against the wall. "I told you never to touch a piano again? Your mother destroyed everything with her lies, and now you dare to bring music into my house." Thunder crashed outside as rain pelted against the windows. Margot bolted from the piano bench, her heart pounding against her ribs. She ducked under Thaddeus's grasp and ran for the door, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden floors. "You can't run from me, girl," his footsteps thundered behind her. "I'm the only one you have left." Margot burst through the front door into the pouring rain, the cold drops mixing with her tears. Her thin nightgown offered no protection as she sprinted down the dark street, puddles splashing beneath her feet. Lightning illuminated the empty roads ahead, the storm matching the chaos in her heart. 2 blocks away, William Hayes stood at his study window, watching the rain when a small figure caught his eye. Something about the child's desperate flight stirred a memory a similar night years ago, when another woman ran through these same streets, clutching evidence that could have changed everything. The screech of tires cut through the storm as a car swerved around the corner. William's heart stopped as he recognized Thaddeus Anderson behind the wheel, hunting down the fleeing child. Without hesitation, he grabbed his coat and keys. Within moments, 3 lives were set on a collision course: a broken child seeking escape, a man consumed by bitter secrets, and another who recognized in this moment a chance to right the wrongs of the past. The storm raged on, its fury matching the intensity of what was about to unfold: a story of justice long denied, of music silenced too soon, and of truth buried beneath years of lies and guilt. If this opening has stirred your emotions and captured your imagination, join us on this journey of healing, redemption, and justice. Subscribe now to witness how music can mend broken hearts and truth can triumph over darkness. Your support keeps stories like this alive. Margot Anderson learned to be invisible at a very young age. Living in the shadows of Thaddeus's sprawling Victorian house on Cedar Street, she perfected the art of silence, of disappearing into corners, of existing without making a sound. Her small frame, delicate features, and dark hair that fell in untamed waves around her face made her look younger than her 8 years of fragility born from years of neglect. Every morning before dawn, while other children slept peacefully in their warm beds, Margot would wake to prepare Thaddeus's breakfast. Her tiny hands, marked with small burns and cuts from countless cooking accidents, would grip pots and pans too heavy for her age. She'd learned that mistakes meant consequences, so she measured each ingredient with trembling precision, praying that today might be different, that today her efforts might finally earn a word of kindness. The kitchen became her prison and sanctuary. Between its peeling wallpaper and cracked tiles, she'd created a world of whispered songs and silent dreams. When Thaddeus was away, she'd hum quietly to herself, remembering fragments of lullabies her mother used to sing, memories that grew fainter with each passing day, like photographs left too long in the sun. School offered little respite. The other children avoided her, their parents having warned them about the daughter of Sarah Anderson, the woman who'd poisoned Emily Hayes. Teachers spoke to her with carefully measured politeness, but their eyes held a mixture of pity and suspicion. During recess, Margot would find a quiet corner of the playground, watching other children play games she'd never been invited to join. At night, when Thaddeus's alcohol-induced slumber filled the house with heavy snoring, Margot would curl up on her thin mattress in the attic, clutching a worn photograph of her mother. Sarah Anderson's smile in the picture seemed to mock the cruelty of fate. How could someone who looked so kind have committed such a terrible crime? But Margot remembered her mother differently, gentle hands braiding her hair, soft voices sharing secrets over cookie dough, and most precious of all, music filling their tiny apartment with joy. The piano had been her mother's life, her passion, her escape. Sarah taught at the local music school, her students adoring her patience and warmth. But all that changed the day Emily Hayes collapsed during a dinner party. The evidence seemed irrefutable: traces of poison in a dish Sarah had prepared, witnesses who spoke of tension between the two women, and a damning letter found in Sarah's possession. The trial was brief, but before sentencing could be passed, Sarah disappeared into the night, leaving behind a 5-year-old Margot and a web of unanswered questions. Thaddeus, Sarah's husband of barely 2 years, received custody of Margot. The transition from loving home to living nightmare happened so quickly that sometimes Margot wondered if she'd imagined her earlier happiness. Thaddeus's grief over Sarah's betrayal twisted into something dark and cruel, and Margot became the target of his bitterness, a living reminder of the woman who had destroyed his reputation. Years passed, and Margot learned to survive. She developed an uncanny ability to read Thaddeus's moods in the sound of his footsteps, the way he closed doors, the rhythm of his breathing. She became expert at anticipating his needs, at making herself useful enough to be tolerated but not so noticeable as to attract his anger. Yet beneath her carefully constructed facade of submission, a fire burned, a hunger for answers, a yearning for music, and a desperate hope that somewhere, somehow, there was more to her mother's story than what the world believed. This morning, like every morning, Margot stood at the stove, preparing eggs exactly as Thaddeus demanded. But today was different. Today, hidden in her apron pocket, was a key she'd discovered in the attic, a key that might unlock more than just the mysterious trunk she'd found behind old boxes. Today, for the first time in 3 years, Margot allowed herself to hope. The memories came in fragments, like shards of a broken mirror, reflecting a past that seemed increasingly unreal. Margot could still smell the cookies baking that fateful afternoon at the Hayes mansion, where her mother had been preparing for one of Emily Hayes's famous dinner parties. Sarah Anderson, respected piano teacher and beloved member of the community, had been particularly excited about this event. It was to be her first time performing for the town's elite. The Hayes mansion stood as a testament to old money and refined taste, its grand halls adorned with paintings, and its centerpiece a magnificent Steinway piano that Emily, herself an accomplished musician, had imported from Europe. Sarah had spent hours practicing for this performance, her dedication fueled by something Margot, at 5 years old, couldn't understand. Now older and wiser, she wondered if her mother had seen this as a chance to secure a better future for them both. That evening played out like a nightmare in slow motion. The elegant dinner, the appreciative murmurs as Sarah took her place at the piano, the first few notes of Chopin's Nocturne filling the air, and then the sudden, terrible sound of Emily Hayes's wine glass shattering on the marble floor. The hostess's collapse, the chaos that followed, and the devastating discovery of poison in her system turned a night of promise into one of horror. The investigation moved with ruthless efficiency. Police found traces of a rare poison in Emily's food, a substance that left her alive but trapped in a coma. When they searched Sarah's small apartment, they discovered a vial of the same poison hidden in a hollowed-out book of sheet music, along with letters suggesting a complex web of jealousy and revenge. The evidence seemed insurmountable, yet Sarah maintained her innocence with quiet desperation. But it was the letter that sealed her fate, a handwritten note describing in detail how to administer the poison gradually, making it appear like natural illness. The handwriting matched Sarah's perfectly, though she swore she'd never seen it before. The night before her sentencing, Sarah vanished, leaving behind only a brief note, "My dearest Margot, sometimes truth hides in the spaces between musical notes. Never stop listening for it. All my love, Mom." 3 days later, they found Sarah's body in the river, clutching a waterlogged envelope. The contents were deemed irrelevant to the case, sealed away in evidence, and forgotten. The official ruling was suicide, but rumors persisted, some claiming she'd been murdered to keep her quiet, others suggesting she'd made a deal with darker forces. For Margot, the truth remained as elusive as the melodies she was no longer allowed to play. Thaddeus's reaction to Sarah's death transformed him. The man who had once shown occasional moments of kindness hardened into someone unrecognizable. He burned Sarah's sheet music, sold her piano, and forbade any mention of music in his house. His grief manifested as rage, and Margot learned to navigate his moods like a sailor avoiding storms at sea. The town's reaction was equally cruel. Former friends crossed the street to avoid them, students' parents withdrew from Sarah's music school, and whispers followed Margot through the halls at school. Like mother, like daughter. They'd say, as if criminality could be inherited like eye color or the shape of one's nose. Yet in her heart, Margot held onto fragments of truth that didn't fit the official narrative. She remembered her mother's joy in teaching, her gentleness with even the most difficult students. Most importantly, she remembered Sarah's absolute devotion to Emily Hayes, how she'd spoken of her mentor with admiration and gratitude. These memories, combined with her mother's final message, suggested a mystery deeper than anyone had cared to investigate. Life at 42 Cedar Street moved to the rhythm of Thaddeus's demands. Each day began before sunrise, with Margot silently descending the creaking attic stairs, careful not to disturb her stepfather's alcohol-induced slumber. The kitchen, with its yellowed walls and perpetually dripping faucet, became her domain, a place where every meal was an exercise in fear and precision. Breakfast had to be ready by 7, eggs cooked to a specific firmness, toast neither too dark nor too light, coffee strong enough to cut through his hangover but not bitter enough to spark his temper. One mistake could turn a quiet morning into hours of verbal assault. Margot had learned to gauge his mood by the sound of his footsteps on the stairs, each heavy thud making her hands tremble as she arranged his plate. School offered little escape from her isolation. In class, she sat alone at the back, excelling in her studies but never raising her hand to answer questions. Teachers marked her papers with high grades but avoided meeting her eyes, as if her mother's alleged crimes might be contagious. During lunch, she'd retreat to the library, finding solace in books about far-off places and different lives. The librarian, Mrs. Thompson, was the only adult who showed her consistent kindness, though even she maintained a careful distance. Afternoons were filled with an endless list of chores: scrubbing floors, washing windows, maintaining Thaddeus's immaculate appearance to the outside world. The house had to be spotless, though he seemed to take pleasure in finding imperfections in her work. "Useless, just like your mother," he'd mutter, inspecting corners for dust or running his finger along windowsills. Each criticism cut deeper than any physical blow could have. Dinner preparations began promptly at 5, another careful dance of timing and temperature. Thaddeus insisted on traditional meals, the kind his mother had made, though he never provided recipes or clear instructions. Each failure earned a new lecture about her worthlessness, each success met with stony silence. Some nights, when his drinking was particularly heavy, he'd throw the food against the wall, forcing her to clean it up while he detailed all the ways she'd ruined his life. In rare moments of solitude, Margot would stand at the kitchen window, watching other families in their homes across the street. Through lit windows, she glimpsed scenes that seemed like paintings of an impossible life: parents helping with homework, family dinners filled with conversation and laughter, children playing without fear. These glimpses of normalcy made her own situation even more painful. Her only true companion was a small notebook hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the attic, its pages filled with sketches of piano keys and fragments of melodies she remembered from her mother's lessons. At night, she'd practice fingering silently on her windowsill, imagining the sound of each note. Music lived in her mind like a secret garden, carefully tended and protected from Thaddeus's destructive reach. The other children in town had created elaborate stories about her house and family. They called it the witch's house, claiming they could hear strange sounds at night, though it was only Thaddeus's drunken rambling. Some braver ones would dare each other to touch the front gate, running away screaming with exaggerated terror. Margot watched these displays from behind curtains, feeling like a character in someone else's ghost story. Yet beneath the weight of servitude and loneliness, something in Margot remained unbroken. Perhaps it was her mother's final words about truth hiding in music, or maybe it was simply the resilience of youth, but she held on to a fierce hope that one day, somehow, everything would change. She just never imagined that change would begin with a hidden key in an old trunk in the attic. The discovery happened on a rain-soaked Tuesday afternoon. Thaddeus had passed out early, his snores echoing through the house like distant thunder. Margot seized this rare opportunity to explore the attic more thoroughly, drawn by the mysterious key she'd found behind a loose baseboard that morning. Its brass surface was tarnished, but the intricate design on the handle stirred something in her memory, a pattern she'd seen before in her mother's jewelry box. The attic was a maze of forgotten things, broken furniture, dusty boxes, and shadows that seemed to hold secrets. Rain drummed against the roof, creating a rhythm that made Margot's fingers twitch with suppressed musical memory. She moved carefully between stacked trunks and covered shapes, looking for anything the key might fit. In the furthest corner, behind a heap of moth-eaten curtains, she found a dark wooden trunk she'd never noticed before. The lock was ornate, matching the key's design perfectly. Her heart pounding, Margot inserted the key. It turned with a click that seemed to echo through time itself. Inside, beneath layers of yellowed tissue paper, lay her mother's world. Sheet music, carefully preserved despite years of neglect, bore Sarah's elegant handwriting in the margins. Photographs spilled out her mother at various recitals, Sarah and Emily Hayes sitting together at a grand piano, both young and laughing. But it was what lay beneath that made Margot's breath catch. A small upright piano, no taller than Margot herself, had been dismantled and carefully stored in pieces. She recognized it instantly from the distinctive rose carving on its music rack, her mother's first piano, the one Sarah had learned on as a child. Thaddeus must have hidden it here rather than sell it, though whether from sentiment or cruelty, Margot couldn't guess. With trembling hands, she lifted out a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. The first envelope bore Emily Hayes's elegant handwriting. "My dearest Sarah." Margot began to read, and the world around her disappeared. "Your progress with the children is remarkable. You have a gift not just for music, but for healing through it. I see how young Timothy's stutter disappears when he sings. How little Anna's grief over her father's death eases at the piano. You're doing more than teaching notes, you're saving lives in your own quiet way. Which is why I must warn you. I've discovered something disturbing about the music school's finances. Someone is." The letter ended abruptly, torn at the bottom. Margot dug deeper, finding more correspondence between her mother and Emily, spanning years. They spoke of music, of teaching, of dreams for expanding the school's reach to underprivileged children. But scattered throughout were hints of something darker, references to missing funds, suspicious accidents, and growing fears. The final letter, dated just days before Emily's poisoning, was written in her mother's hurried hand. "Emily, I found proof. The records show years of embezzlement. And I know who's responsible. We need to meet privately. Your husband's dinner party will be perfect. Everyone will be distracted with the music. I'll bring the documents. We can finally expose." Margot's hands shook as she processed the implications. Her mother hadn't been plotting against Emily, they had been working together to uncover something. But what? And who had really been behind Emily's poisoning? A floorboard creaked behind her. Margot whirled around, clutching the letters to her chest, but it was only the house settling in the rain. Still, the sound reminded her of the danger. If Thaddeus found her with these discoveries. Working quickly but carefully, she began examining the dismantled piano. The pieces seemed intact, and among her mother's papers she found detailed instructions for its assembly. A plan started forming in her mind, dangerous, perhaps impossible, but necessary. If music had been at the heart of this mystery, perhaps it could also be the key to solving it. She carefully repacked everything except one photograph and the most revealing letters, which she tucked into her dress pocket. As she locked the trunk, a new sound froze her in place: heavy footsteps on the stairs below, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of Thaddeus's angry muttering. Margot's heart raced as she slid the key back into its hiding place. She had found more than just old memories in that trunk. She had found purpose, and perhaps the beginning of a path to truth. But first she had to face whatever was coming up those stairs. The attic door burst open with such force that dust motes danced in the sudden rush of air. Thaddeus filled the doorframe, his massive silhouette backlit by the hallway light. The smell of whiskey preceded him, and his eyes held that dangerous gleam Margot had learned to fear. "What are you doing up here, girl?" His words slurred slightly, but his gaze was sharp as it swept the room. "Been going through things that don't belong to you." Margot stood very still, hoping the dim light would hide the slight bulge of letters in her pocket. "I was just cleaning," like you asked. Her voice sounded small, even to her own ears. Thaddeus took a heavy step forward, then another. "Cleaning?" With these he held up her dust-free hands, gripping her wrist tight enough to make her wince. "Try again, Margot, and this time don't lie to me." Something in his tone made her realize he knew, or at least suspected. Perhaps he'd been watching her all along, waiting for this moment. The thought gave her an unexpected surge of courage. "I want to know about Mom," she said, lifting her chin. "About what really happened that night at the Hayes mansion." The change in his expression was instant and terrifying. His face contorted, and before Margot could react, he had seized her shoulders, shaking her violently. "Your mother," he spat. "Your mother was a treacherous snake who destroyed everything she touched, just like you're trying to do now." "She wasn't," Margot cried out, the letters crackling in her pocket. "She and Emily Hayes were friends. They were trying to help people, to expose something." The slap caught her off guard, sending her stumbling against an old dresser. "Help people?" Thaddeus laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Is that what you think? Let me tell you about your precious mother's help. She came into my life with her music and her dreams, made me believe in something better. Then she conspired with that rich woman, thinking they could play detective, thinking they could change things." He grabbed a stack of sheet music from a nearby box, tearing the pages as he spoke. "Your mother didn't care about who she hurt along the way. She didn't care that her meddling would destroy lives. And now you're just like her, sneaking around, asking questions that should stay buried." Margot watched the torn pages flutter to the floor, each one a piece of her mother's legacy destroyed. "You're lying," she whispered, then louder, "You're lying. Mom would never hurt Emily. They were working together to stop someone." Thaddeus's hand shot out, catching her throat. "Stop right there," he growled, his face inches from hers. "You think you know so much? Let me show you what happens to people who dig too deep." He dragged her to the attic window, forcing her to look out at the Hayes mansion in the distance. "See that house? Your mother thought she was so clever, gathering evidence, making plans with Emily Hayes. But some secrets are meant to stay hidden, Margot. Some questions shouldn't be asked." Then his eyes fell on something protruding from her pocket, the corner of a photograph. Before she could stop him, he'd snatched it out, staring at the image of Sarah and Emily at the piano. His face went through a series of emotions: shock, rage, and something else, something that looked almost like fear. "Where did you find this?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "What else did you find?" But Margot had seen that flash of fear, and it gave her strength. "Enough to know you're hiding something," she said. Mom and Emily were close to exposing someone? That's why Mom disappeared, isn't it? Not because she was guilty, but because she knew too much. The photograph burst into flames as Thaddeus lit it with his lighter. Your mother disappeared because she made choices, he said, watching the image curl and blacken. Bad choices. Don't make the same mistake, Margot. Some doors should stay locked, some songs should stay unsung. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. Clean up this mess. And if I catch you up here again going through these things, asking these questions, he left the threat unfinished, but his meaning was clear. After he was gone, Margot sank to the floor among the torn sheets of music, her cheek stinging, her throat sore. But something had changed. In Thaddeus's reaction, in his fear, she had glimpsed a truth he never meant to reveal. Her mother hadn't been a criminal, she'd been silenced. Now Margot knew she had to act fast. Whatever was hidden in those letters, whatever truth her mother and Emily had discovered, it was dangerous enough to kill for. And somewhere in the Hayes mansion, a woman lay in a coma, holding secrets that could change everything. Thunder rolled across the sky as Margot gathered her few precious possessions, the letters from her pocket, her mother's locket, and the small notebook of remembered melodies. From downstairs came the sounds of Thaddeus's drunken rage, furniture being overturned, glass shattering, his voice rising in incoherent threats. She knew tonight would be worse than any before. The attic had one window, small and round, that overlooked the street below. Margot had often stared through it, dreaming of escape, but never daring. Now, as lightning illuminated the old oak tree, whose branches reached close to the house, she saw her path to freedom. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, rain lashing against the window panes. She could hear Thaddeus stomping up the stairs, his heavy footfalls making the whole house shudder. "Margot," he bellowed, "get down here now. We're not finished." With trembling hands, she pushed open the window. The wind whipped rain into her face as she gauged the distance to the nearest branch. It wasn't too far if she could just reach it. Behind her, the attic door handle began to turn. "You think you can hide from me?" Thaddeus's voice was closer now. "I won't let you destroy everything like your mother did." Margot climbed onto the windowsill, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The branch swayed in the wind, slick with rain. Another crash of thunder masked the sound of her first step onto the tree limb. The attic door flew open just as she pulled her legs through the window. Thaddeus's roar of rage followed her into the storm. The branch beneath her feet creaked ominously as she inched forward, trying to keep her balance against the wind that tore at her clothes. "Get back here!" Thaddeus appeared at the window, his face contorted with fury. He reached out, fingers grasping at air as Margot scrambled further along the branch. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the ground below so far down it made her dizzy. Rain plastered her hair to her face as she clung to the wet bark. One slip, one wrong move, and she would fall. But behind her, Thaddeus was already forcing his bulk through the window. The branch began to bend under their combined weight. Margot heard it crack and made a desperate decision. Closing her eyes, she jumped for a lower branch, catching it with both hands. The impact sent shock waves through her arms, but she held on. Thaddeus's curses were drowned out by another roll of thunder as Margot swung herself down, branch by branch, scraping her hands and knees but never stopping. When her feet finally touched the ground, she ran blindly into the storm. Behind her, she heard the crash of breaking branches and Thaddeus's howl of pain. She didn't look back, focusing only on putting one foot in front of the other, splashing through puddles that reflected the lightning above. The streets were deserted, the storm driving everyone inside. Margot ran past darkened houses, their windows glowing with the warmth and safety she'd never known. Her lungs burned, but she couldn't stop. She heard a car engine roar to life in the distance. Thaddeus would be coming for her. Her feet carried her instinctively toward the Hayes mansion. Something about those letters, about her mother's connection to Emily Hayes, told her it was where she needed to be. The grand house loomed ahead, its windows mostly dark except for one a study where a single lamp burned. As she reached the iron gates, headlights swept around the corner behind her. Thaddeus's car swerved on the wet road, engine gunning as he spotted her. Margot squeezed through a gap in the gates, just as the car mounted the curb. "You can't hide from me," his voice carried over the storm. "I'll find you, just like I found her." The words hit Margot like a physical blow. What did he mean? Had he found her mother that night? Had he? She couldn't complete the thought. Instead, she focused on running up the long driveway toward the mansion's front door. Behind her, she heard the screech of brakes, the sound of a car door slamming, and Thaddeus's heavy footsteps on gravel. The distance between them was closing. Rain blurred her vision as she reached the front steps, her small fist pounding on the massive wooden door. "Please," she cried out, her voice nearly lost in the storm. "Please help me." The porch light flickered on, casting her shadow long across the rain-swept steps. As Thaddeus's footsteps grew closer, the door began to open, and Margot's fate hung suspended between her violent past and an uncertain future. The door opened with the weight of history, revealing William Hayes silhouetted against warm lamplight. His tall frame filled the doorway, and his eyes sharp despite the late hour took in the scene before him a drenched child trembling on his doorstep, and behind her the looming figure of Thaddeus Anderson emerging from the storm. "Get away from my door," Anderson Williams' voice cut through the rain with authority. "You're not welcome here." Thaddeus stumbled to a stop at the bottom of the steps, rain dripping from his disheveled form. "That's my daughter you're harboring, Hayes. She's coming home with me." William looked down at Margot, noting her bruised cheek and the terror in her eyes. Something shifted in his expression, recognition perhaps, or memory. Without taking his eyes off Thaddeus, he placed a protective hand on Margot's shoulder. "Inside," he said softly to her, then louder to Thaddeus, "She's not going anywhere with you. Not tonight. Not ever again." Margot darted past him into the warmth of the foyer, her wet shoes squeaking on the polished marble floor. The interior of the Hayes mansion was exactly as her mother had described it, grand, yet welcoming, with music sheets scattered across various surfaces and the magnificent Steinway piano dominating the adjacent room. "You don't understand what you're doing," Hayes Thaddeus snarled, taking a step up. "That girl is dangerous. She's just like her mother, digging up things better left buried." William's stance changed subtly, becoming more defensive. "Sarah was never dangerous, Anderson. She was close to the truth, wasn't she? That's what really frightened you." The mention of Sarah's name seemed to push Thaddeus over the edge. He lunged forward, but William was faster, shoving him back down the steps. "I'm calling the police," William announced, "and this time they'll hear the whole story." Thaddeus's laugh was ugly, desperate. "You think they'll believe you? The grieving husband whose wife lies in a coma because of that woman's daughter. They'll see her for what she is, poison, just like her mother." Inside, Margot pressed herself against the wall, clutching her mother's letters tightly. Through the open door, she watched the confrontation, her whole body trembling. But then something caught her eye, a photograph on a nearby table. It showed her mother and Emily Hayes at the piano, identical to the one Thaddeus had burned, but this copy held something she hadn't noticed before. In the background, partially hidden by a curtain, stood a figure watching the two women with an expression that chilled her blood. William's voice drew her attention back to the door. "Leave now, Anderson. Or I'll tell them about the missing funds from the music school, about Sarah's investigation, about everything." Thaddeus stumbled backward, his face pale despite the rain. "You don't know anything," he spat, but his voice held a note of fear. "I know more than you think," William replied. "Emily wasn't just Sarah's friend, she was her protector. And now I'll protect her daughter the way I should have protected them both." Thunder punctuated his words as Thaddeus retreated into the storm, his threats carried away by the wind. William closed the door firmly, its heavy thud echoing through the foyer. When he turned to Margot, his stern expression softened. "You look just like her," he said quietly, then seemed to catch himself. "You're soaked through. Let's get you warm and dry before we talk." Margot stood frozen, unsure whether to trust this sudden kindness. Why, she managed to ask, "Why would you help me? After what they say my mother did to your wife?" William knelt before her, his eyes level with hers. "Because, Margot Anderson, I've spent 7 years wondering if we got everything wrong. Your mother was trying to tell us something the night Emily was poisoned. Something in the music she was supposed to play." Margot's hand went to her pocket, feeling the crinkle of her mother's letters. "She left me a message," she whispered. She said, "The truth hides in the spaces between musical notes." William's eyes widened slightly. He stood, glancing toward the room where the Steinway waited. Perhaps he said slowly, "It's time we listen more carefully to what Sarah was trying to tell us." He led Margot toward the grand staircase, past walls lined with photographs chronicling years of musical performances and happy memories. At the top he paused outside a door. "Rest tonight. Tomorrow we'll begin to unravel this mystery together. You're safe here, Margot, I promise." As she followed him into a guest room larger than Thaddeus's entire attic, Margot felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. But mixed with that hope was fear, because she'd seen the photograph, seen what neither her mother nor Emily Hayes had noticed that day: Thaddeus watching from the shadows, his hand clutching something that glinted like glass, a vial perhaps, or a bottle. Dawn brought an uneasy tension to the Hayes mansion. Margot awoke in unfamiliar luxury, her body stiff from running but her mind startlingly clear. Outside her door she could hear the quiet efficiency of the household staff, whispered conversations that stopped when she appeared, sidelong glances that carried generations of suspicion. Mrs. Mitchell, the elderly housekeeper who had served the Hayes family for 30 years, made no effort to hide her disapproval. As she brought Margot's breakfast, her hands trembled slightly, and she tested each dish herself before allowing it near William's study. "We can't be too careful," she said pointedly. "Not after what happened to poor Mrs. Hayes." William spent the morning making phone calls behind closed doors, his voice rising and falling in patterns Margot couldn't quite decipher. When he finally emerged, his face was drawn with worry. "The police are looking for Thaddeus," he explained, "but there's resistance. Your mother's case left deep scars in this community." The grandfather clock in the hall struck 10, each chime emphasizing the weight of history between them. William led Margot to his study, a room lined with leather-bound books and filing cabinets. He sat behind his desk, studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "I want to trust you, Margot," he said finally, "but you must understand my position. Emily is everything to me. The night she was poisoned, your mother was the last person to handle her food. The evidence was overwhelming." Margot placed her mother's letters on his desk with trembling hands. But what if the evidence was planted? Mom and Mrs. Hayes were working together, investigating something at the music school. William picked up the letters, his expression guarded. As he read, his frown deepened. "These suggest, but no, it's impossible." The police investigated thoroughly. Every account was examined. By whom Margot pressed? Who was in charge of the music school's finances when Mum started teaching there? The question hung in the air like smoke. William's eyes darted to a photograph on his wall, the school's board of directors, with Thaddeus Anderson standing prominently among them. Something shifted in his expression, doubt creeping in at the edges. A knock at the door made them both jump. Dr. Winters, Emily's private physician, entered with his usual air of authority. His face darkened when he saw Margot. "William, a word, please." "In private." They stepped into the hallway, but their voices carried. "Have you lost your mind?" Dr. Winters hissed. "Harboring that woman's child? After everything that happened?" "James, she's just a girl," William responded. And there are questions about Sarah's case that need answers. The only question Dr. Winters cut in is how long before history repeats itself. That family is poison, William. The sooner you accept that, the safer we'll all be. Margot's hands clenched into fists, her mother's words echoing in her mind. Truth hides in the spaces between musical notes. She slipped out of the study's other door, following the familiar pull toward the music room. The Steinway stood exactly as it had 7 years ago, its black surface reflecting the morning light. Without thinking, Margot lifted the cover, her fingers hovering over the keys. One note, just one. "Don't touch that," Mrs. Mitchell's sharp voice cracked like a whip. "That piano hasn't been played since my mother's last performance," Margot finished quietly. "The night everything changed." The housekeeper's face softened slightly. "You look so much like her, standing there. Sarah was. She was kind to me before. Always had a smile, a gentle word. I never understood how she could." Her voice trailed off. William returned, looking troubled. "Dr. Winters has concerns," he said carefully. "Perhaps it would be better if we found somewhere else for you to stay." Margot felt her world tilting again. "Please," she whispered, pulling out the last letter from her pocket. "Mom wrote this the day she died. She said she had proof. She was trying to protect Mrs. Hayes, not hurt her." William took the letter, his hands unsteady. As he read, color drained from his face. "These numbers," he muttered. "I've seen them before in Emily's private records. She was tracking something, comparing accounts." A sound from upstairs interrupted him, monitors beeping urgently from Emily's room. Dr. Winters rushed past them, medical bag in hand. But it was his dropped notebook that caught Margot's eye, falling open to reveal a familiar pattern of numbers, identical to those in her mother's letter. William stared at the notebook, then at Margot, years of certainty crumbling in his eyes. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "it's time we let the music play again. Your mother always said that every song tells a story. Maybe it's time we heard hers." The afternoon light filtered through the stained glass windows of Emily's room, casting colorful shadows across her still form. William led Margot inside with quiet reverence, his hand gentle on her shoulder. The room was a shrine to music. Photographs of performances lined the walls, and in the corner stood a small upright piano, dusty from years of silence. "Emily always said music could reach places medicine couldn't," William explained softly. "Before everything, this room was filled with melodies. She would teach here when students were too sick to travel to the school." Margot approached Emily's bedside carefully. The woman's face was peaceful, unchanged by the years, like a sleeping Snow White in a fairy tale. The steady beep of monitors provided a mechanical rhythm to the room's silence. "The last piece she heard was your mother's," William continued. "Chopin's Nocturne in B-flat minor. Sarah never finished playing it." Without thinking, Margot hummed the opening bars. William's sharp intake of breath made her stop, but his eyes were glistening. "That's exactly how Sarah played it," he whispered. "Not just the notes, but the feeling behind them." Moving to the small piano, Margot lifted the cover. Years of dust had settled on the keys, but underneath they were perfectly preserved. "Mom taught me this piece," she said quietly. She said it was Mrs. Hayes's favorite. "Play it," William said suddenly. When Margot hesitated, he added, "Please. It's been too long since these walls heard music." The first notes were tentative, like birds testing their wings after a storm. But as Margot's confidence grew, the melody took flight. She played as her mother had taught her, letting the music tell its story, not just of sadness, but of hope hidden within darkness. Something changed in the room's atmosphere. The monitor's steady beeping shifted slightly, matching the rhythm of the nocturne. William rushed to Emily's side, watching intently as her fingers twitched almost imperceptibly against the sheets. "Keep playing," he urged, his voice thick with emotion. "She's responding to the music." Margot continued, her mother's lessons flowing through her fingers. Each phrase seemed to carry memories Sarah and Emily laughing at the grand piano, sharing secrets between measures, building dreams of a music school that could change lives. As she reached the passage where the melody usually turned dark, Margot remembered something her mother had said: "Music is a language, sweetheart. Sometimes the most important words are hidden in the spaces between notes." She slowed down, paying attention to those spaces, the brief moments of silence between phrases. There was a pattern there, something familiar. It matched the rhythm of numbers in her mother's letters, not random figures, but a code set to music. William must have noticed too. He was staring at the piano with newfound intensity. The ledger entries, he murmured, they followed this same pattern. Emily and Sarah weren't just teaching music, they were documenting something, hiding it in plain sight. The final notes of the nocturne faded away, but their echo seemed to linger. In her bed, Emily's breathing had changed, becoming deeper, more purposeful. Dr. Winters, who had entered silently during the performance, checked her vital signs with obvious surprise. "Her neural activity has increased significantly," he admitted reluctantly. "It's almost as if..." "Oh, as if she's trying to wake up," William finished. He turned to Margot, really seeing her for the first time. "Your mother wasn't trying to silence Emily that night, she was trying to help her speak." Margot nodded, her hands still resting on the keys. "The poison wasn't meant for Mrs. Hayes, was it? Mom found something in the school's records, something worth killing for. She and Mrs. Hayes were going to expose it that night, using this piece as their evidence." William moved to a filing cabinet in the corner, pulling out dusty folders. Emily kept copies of everything. If Sarah hid a message in the music, there might be more hidden in these records. The afternoon sun was setting, painting the room in deep golds and purples. As William and Margot began sorting through years of paperwork, the small piano stood witness to a new partnership, forming one built on shared loss, shared hope, and the healing power of truth finally coming to light. In her bed, Emily Hayes's fingers continued their subtle dance, matching the rhythm of a code hidden in music, waiting for someone to finally hear its message. The days that followed brought subtle changes to the Hayes mansion. The heavy curtains that had shrouded windows for years were drawn back, letting sunlight stream across polished floors. Music, once forbidden, now flowed freely through the halls as Margot practiced daily on the small, upright piano in Emily's room. William found himself lingering in doorways, watching Margot play with an intensity that mirrored her mother's. Her small figure at the piano stirred memories not just of Sarah, but of his own daughter Catherine, lost to illness years before Emily's poisoning. He noticed how Margot would scrunch her nose in concentration, exactly as Catherine had done during her lessons. "She would have been your age now," he told Margot one evening, surprising them both with the confession. They were sorting through more of Emily's files, looking for patterns in the financial records. "Catherine loved music as much as you do. She and your mother had special lessons every Thursday." Margot's hands stilled over the papers. "Mom never mentioned she taught another girl my age." But she wouldn't have, William replied softly. Catherine's death hit Sarah particularly hard. They were very close. It was Sarah who suggested naming the music school scholarship program after her. The revelation created a shift in their relationship. William began sharing more stories over breakfast tales of Emily's concerts, Sarah's teaching innovations, the dreams they'd had for expanding music education to underprivileged children. Margot soaked up every detail, finally able to see her mother as more than just the villain of other people's stories. Even Mrs. Mitchell's stern demeanor began to thaw. She caught Margot one morning, attempting to make her own breakfast rather than waiting to be served. Instead of scolding, the housekeeper rolled up her sleeves and taught her how to make Emily's favorite scones. "Your mother used to bake these with me," she admitted, demonstrating how to cut cold butter into flour. She said music and baking were similar, both needed patience and precise measurements. The household staff, following Mrs. Mitchell's lead, gradually stopped their whispered conversations when Margot entered rooms. The gardener showed her Emily's rose garden, explaining how Sarah had help plant many of the bushes. The cook taught her to make hot chocolate the way her mother had preferred it, with a pinch of cinnamon and tiny marshmallows. But it was in Emily's room that the most profound changes occurred. Margot spent hours there playing the piano while William read to his wife from her favorite books. They noticed that Emily's vital signs would stabilize during the music, her fingers sometimes moving in time with familiar pieces. One afternoon, while Margot was playing a particularly complex passage from Bach, Emily's hand actually lifted slightly from the bed. William was beside her instantly, hope illuminating his features. "She's trying to conduct," he whispered. "She always moved her hands like this during this section." The moment sparked a new routine. Each day, Margot would play through Emily's favorite repertoire, while William documented every response, no matter how small. They created charts matching musical pieces to physical reactions, building a language of communication through melody and rhythm. Dr. Winters, despite his initial skepticism, couldn't deny the improvements in Emily's condition. Her brain activity increases significantly during these sessions, he admitted during a checkup. It's as if the music is creating new neural pathways. Late one night, unable to sleep, Margot wandered down to the music room. She found William at the grand piano, staring at a photograph of Emily, Sarah, and Catherine at a recital. His fingers traced the edges of the frame as he spoke without turning. "I was angry for so long," he said quietly. "At Sarah, at the world, at myself for not protecting them. But watching you these past weeks, seeing how music flows through you just like it did through them. I understand now what Emily and Sarah were trying to build. It wasn't just a school, it was a family." Margot sat beside him on the piano bench. Hesitantly, she placed her small hand over his. "Mom used to say that music makes its own families, that when you share something that deep, it connects you forever." William smiled, turning his hand to squeeze hers. She was right. And perhaps that's what they were really protecting, not just financial records or evidence of crimes, but the family they'd created through music. From that night forward, something fundamental changed in their relationship. William began teaching Margot about running the music school, sharing Emily's vision for its future. He hung photographs of Sarah in the halls again, restoring her place in the mansion's history. Mrs. Mitchell found them one morning, asleep in Emily's room, William in his usual chair, Margot curled up on the window seat, sheet music scattered around them like fallen leaves. Instead of waking them, she simply covered Margot with a blanket and quietly closed the door. Later that day, she placed a small box on Margot's bed. Inside was a collection of recipes, handwritten by Sarah and Emily, notes scribbled in margins documenting their friendship. "I've been saving these, Mrs." Mitchell explained, her usual briskness softened by memory, waiting for someone who would understand their value. The mansion, once a mausoleum to lost dreams, began to feel like a home again. Music and laughter echoed through its halls, and if anyone noticed that William had started referring to Margot as "our girl" when speaking to Emily, they simply smiled and nodded in agreement. Yet beneath this growing warmth, questions still lingered. The coded messages in Sarah's music remained unbroken, and somewhere in the city, Thaddeus Anderson waited, guarding secrets that could shatter their newfound peace. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of scattered sheet music. Margot had organized Emily's compositions carefully, arranging them by date and complexity as she searched for hidden patterns. But one morning she found the pages subtly rearranged, certain measures marked with barely visible pencil dots. William dismissed it initially, suggesting the cleaning staff might have disturbed them while dusting. But then other small disturbances began to accumulate. The practice room door, always locked at night, would be found slightly ajar. The security system reported brief power fluctuations at odd hours. Sheet music with Sarah's annotations disappeared, only to reappear days later with certain passages highlighted. One evening, while Margot was practicing Chopin's Nocturne, she noticed movement in the garden through the reflection in the piano's polished surface. A figure stood among Emily's roses, watching the house. When William investigated, he found fresh cigarette butts, the same brand Thaddeus favored, and footprints in the soft earth. "Someone's trying to find something," Margot said, examining the marked sheet music. "They're following the same patterns Mom used in her code." The incidents escalated. Mrs. Mitchell discovered the lock on the filing cabinet picked, though nothing appeared to be missing. The gardener reported tools rearranged in his shed, and strange cars began appearing on their street, parking for hours before driving away. Dr. Winters grew increasingly agitated during his visits, his questions about Margot's activities becoming more pointed. It's unnatural they overheard him telling William. "The girl spends hours with those old papers and music sheets, just like her mother did before. Well, we all know what happened." William installed additional security cameras, but they occasionally captured only static during crucial moments. The police, when called, found no evidence of forced entry, suggesting whoever was watching them had intimate knowledge of the mansion's layout. Late one night, Margot woke to the sound of piano keys being pressed very softly downstairs. She crept to the music room, expecting to find William, but instead saw a shadow moving away from the grand piano. On the music stand lay a newspaper clipping she'd never seen before, an article about Sarah's death, with certain words circled in red. "They're sending us a message," William said, examining the article. "Someone's afraid we're getting too close to the truth." The next day, while reviewing Emily's old records, they found a pattern of unauthorized access to the music school's accounts, all occurring during Sarah's evening lessons. The dates corresponded perfectly with the marked measures in the scattered sheet music. Mom wasn't just teaching during those hours, Margot realized. She was gathering evidence, but someone must have seen her. A breakthrough came when Mrs. Mitchell mentioned that Dr. Winters had been asking about Emily's old prescription records. He was very insistent, she said, frowning. Said he needed to review her medication history, but those records were lost years ago. William's face darkened. "Not lost," he corrected. "Sarah had them the night of the dinner party. She showed them to Emily, right before." The implications hung heavy in the air. That evening they found Emily's room door unlocked, though both were certain they'd secured it. On her bedside table lay a single rose knot from her garden, but the same variety Sarah had been holding when they found her body. "It's a warning," William said, his voice tight with anger. "They're reminding us what happened to Sarah when she got too close." Margot spent that night in Emily's room, playing softly as she watched shadows move across the garden. During a pause between pieces, she heard Emily's breathing change rhythm, matching the pattern of a particular measure, one that Sarah had marked repeatedly in her teaching notes. The next morning, another article appeared, this time pushed under the front door. It detailed the music school's financial success under its new management after Sarah's death. Certain numbers in the report were underlined, forming a sequence that matched the rhythm Emily had breathed. "They're watching us right now," Margot whispered, noticing a car slowly passing the house, "but they don't realize we're starting to understand the code." William gathered their evidence, the marked music sheets, Emily's breathing patterns, the financial records, and Sarah's last letters. Spread across his study floor, a pattern emerged, one that pointed to a conspiracy larger than they'd imagined. "Your mother wasn't just uncovering embezzlement," William said, connecting the dots. "She found something bigger, something worth killing for." That night, as Margot played her mother's last unfinished piece, a shadow fell across the piano keys. By the time she turned around, it was gone, but on the bench lay a photograph she'd never seen before. It showed Sarah, Emily, and Dr. Winters at a board meeting, but in the background, partially hidden, was a familiar face examining papers he shouldn't have had access to. Thaddeus Anderson wasn't just Emily's poisoner. He had been working with someone inside the mansion all along. The breakthrough came on a rainy Sunday afternoon. While searching through Emily's old music books, Margot discovered a false bottom in her sheet music cabinet. Hidden beneath decades of scores lay a leather portfolio, its contents preserved like pressed flowers between pages of time. Local music teacher suspected in Hayes' poisoning screamed the headline of the first yellowed clipping. The article painted Sarah Anderson as a jealous protégé, desperate to take control of the prestigious Hayes Music School. But in the margins, Emily had written careful notes, circling inconsistencies in the official story. Sources claim Anderson had access to rare toxins through her husband's pharmaceutical connections, read another piece. William's hands trembled as he read Emily's annotation, wrong compound. T's inventory shows different purchase. Check dates. The portfolio contained more than just news articles. Between them lay financial records showing a pattern of large withdrawals from the school's accounts. Each transaction corresponded with dates marked in Sarah's teaching ledger, but the signatures authorizing them didn't match any known board member. "Look at this," Margot said, pulling out a photograph tucked behind a particularly damning article. It showed the school's board of directors at their annual meeting. Dr. Winters stood prominently in the center, but it was the document visible on the table before him that caught their attention, the same financial records Sarah had been investigating. William spread the clippings across his study floor, arranging them chronologically. These articles changed after Sarah died, he noted. The focus shifted from evidence to character assassination. Someone wanted to make sure her reputation was destroyed completely. A series of smaller articles documented the aftermath: Sarah's disappearance, the discovery of her body, the quick ruling of suicide. But Emily had question marks next to each official conclusion and references to pages in her personal diary, pages that had been torn out the night of the poisoning. The most revealing piece was buried at the bottom of the portfolio, a half-written article that never made it to print. It detailed discrepancies in the school's financial reports, mentioning a private investigation initiated by Emily Hayes. The article was dated the day before the fateful dinner party. Mom wasn't just gathering evidence, Margot realized, her voice thick with emotion. She was working with a journalist. They were going to expose everything. Another envelope contained photographs from the school's security cameras showing late-night meetings in the building's offices. Dr. Winters appeared in several, accompanied by shadowy figures whose faces were carefully turned away from the cameras. Dates on the photos matched withdrawals from the school's accounts. Most disturbing was a series of medical records showing a pattern of suspicious deaths among elderly patrons who had made substantial donations to the school. Each case had been handled by Dr. Winters, each death attributed to natural causes. The music school was just the beginning, William said, connecting the pieces. They were using it to launder money from something much darker. Emily and Sarah must have discovered the whole operation. The final clipping was the most personal, an obituary for Catherine Hayes, William's daughter. Emily's handwritten note beside it was almost illegible with emotion. Kay's treatment changed after the donation. James insisted. Need to check his other cases. But Margot's hands shook as she realized the implications. Dr. Winters was Catherine's physician too, wasn't he? William nodded, his face ashen. He said her condition was untreatable. We donated substantially to his research fund, hoping he could save other children. But if he was involved in all this? A thunderclap made them both jump, and in that moment of silence they heard it, the subtle click of a camera shutter from outside the study window. By the time William reached the curtain, there was only the glimpse of a retreating figure and the sound of a car engine starting. They worked through the night, copying every document and photograph. The original portfolio was returned to its hiding place, but not before they discovered one final piece of evidence, a small key taped to the back of Emily's last photograph, with a note in Sarah's handwriting: safety deposit box 247, First National. The truth is in the music. As dawn broke, Margot sat at the piano, playing the piece her mother had left unfinished the night of the poisoning. In the growing light, she noticed something she'd missed before: tiny numbers written between the staves, corresponding exactly to the suspicious transactions in the school's accounts. She hid the evidence in plain sight, Margot whispered. Every piece she taught, every concert she played, they were all part of the record. But as they gathered their discoveries, a shadow fell across the piano keys. Dr. Winters stood in the doorway, his medical bag clutched tightly in one hand. Emily seems quite agitated this morning, he said smoothly. I think it's time for a stronger sedative. Behind him, they could hear Mrs. Mitchell's muffled protests from the hallway and the heavy tread of familiar footsteps climbing the main stairs. The game of shadows was about to become dangerously real. Thaddeus burst into the music room like a thunderstorm, his massive frame blocking the doorway as Dr. Winters stepped aside with calculated precision. The morning light cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the dangerous gleam in his eyes. Step away from the piano, Margot, he commanded, his voice deceptively calm. It's time to end this little performance. William moved instinctively between them, but Dr. Winters produced a small revolver from his medical bag. Please, Mr. Hayes, he said smoothly. Let's handle this like civilized people. The girl belongs with her legal guardian. Margot's fingers remained frozen over the piano keys, her mother's unfinished melody hanging in the air. Through the reflection in the polished wood, she could see Mrs. Mitchell being restrained by two men in suits the same shadowy figures from Emily's photographs. You can't take her, William declared, though his voice wavered slightly. We know what you did, what both of you did. The evidence. Thaddeus's laugh was harsh. Evidence? Like the kind Sarah thought she had, he moved closer, his shoes leaving muddy prints on the pristine floor. Your wife's condition could deteriorate so easily, Hayes. One wrong medication, one missed dose. And the threat hung heavy in the air. Margot felt her heart pounding against her ribs, the rhythm matching the coded sequence hidden in her mother's music. She began to play softly, almost unconsciously, her fingers finding the notes that contained Sarah's hidden message. Stop that, Thaddeus snapped, but Dr. Winters held up his hand. Let her play, he said, a cruel smile playing at his lips. It's fitting, isn't it? Mother and daughter, both trying to speak through music, both silenced. William's face drained of color as he understood the implication. You killed her, he whispered. Sarah didn't commit suicide. You murdered her. Sarah was careless, Thaddeus growled. She thought hiding numbers in music made her clever. Thought she could expose us without consequences. He turned to Margot, his expression darkening. Just like her daughter, thinking she can dig up the past without getting buried in it. The melody grew stronger under Margot's fingers, each note a defiance. She reached the passage where her mother had stopped playing that fateful night. But this time she continued. The coded sequence completed itself, revealing the full pattern of transactions and dates. Dr. Winters noticed too late what she was doing. Enough he moved to grab her, but the sudden sound of sirens in the distance made him hesitate. Thaddeus lunged forward, seizing Margot's arm and yanking her from the piano bench. You're coming home now, he snarled. And this time I'll make sure you never touch another piano again. But something had changed in Margot. The terror that had controlled her for so long transformed into a different kind of strength, her mother's strength. You killed her, she said, her voice steady despite his crushing grip. But you couldn't kill the truth. It's been here all along, waiting in the music. The sirens grew closer. Dr. Winters moved nervously toward the door, but William blocked his path. The police aren't coming for her, he said quietly. They're coming for you. Both of you. Thaddeus's grip tightened painfully on Margot's arm. Tell them, Hayes. Tell them I'm taking my daughter home, or your precious Emily might not wake up tomorrow. Emily's already awake, Margot said suddenly, causing everyone to turn toward her. She's been awakening slowly, remembering. That's why you've been increasing her sedatives, isn't it, Dr. Winters? You're afraid of what she might say. The look that passed between Thaddeus and Dr. Winters confirmed everything. The doctor's hand tightened on his revolver, but the sound of police breaking down the front door echoed through the mansion. In the chaos that followed, Thaddeus made his final, desperate move. He dragged Margot toward the French doors leading to the garden, but she was no longer the frightened child he could control. As his grip loosened for a moment, she did what her mother had taught her in those long-ago piano lessons. She found her own rhythm, her own strength, and broke free. The moments that followed seemed to unfold in slow motion. As Margot broke free from Thaddeus's grip, William faced an impossible choice. Dr. Winters still held the revolver, its barrel now pointed squarely at Emily's room upstairs. The message was clear: stop Thaddeus, or save his wife. Think carefully, Hayes, Dr. Winters said softly. We've kept Emily alive all these years. One wrong move now, he left the threat unfinished, his meaning crystal clear. But in that crucial moment, William saw something that changed everything. Through the open door of the music room, he caught a glimpse of Emily's monitor screen reflecting in the hallway mirror. Her brainwave patterns matched the rhythm of Margot's interrupted piano piece perfectly. She wasn't just responding to the music, she was remembering. You never kept her alive, William said, his voice growing stronger. You kept her prisoner, just like you did to Sarah. But Emily's been fighting back, hasn't she? Every time Margot plays, she gets closer to the truth. Thaddeus lunged for Margot again, but William moved with a speed that surprised everyone, including himself. He tackled the larger man, sending them both crashing into the grand piano. The impact created a discordant symphony of struck keys and splintering wood. She's just a child, William shouted, struggling with Thaddeus. A child who lost her mother because of your greed. Dr. Winters aimed his revolver at the grappling men, but his hand trembled. The police were closing in upstairs, their footsteps thundering above. He couldn't risk a gunshot drawing their attention. William fought with the desperate strength of a man who had spent 7 years in silent grief. Each punch he landed was for Sarah, for Emily, for the young girl who played piano with his dead daughter's dedication. But most of all, he fought for the truth that had been buried beneath years of carefully constructed lies. You don't understand what's at stake, Thaddeus growled, landing a heavy blow to William's ribs. The school was just the beginning. There are people involved who will bury all of us. But William had stopped listening to threats. As they struggled, he saw Margot slip away from Dr. Winters, moving toward the piano with purposeful steps. She began to play again, her small hands sure and steady on the keys that remained undamaged. The melody rose above the sounds of combat, its coded message now unmistakable. Each note corresponded to a transaction, each rhythm to a date, creating an irrefutable record of years of corruption and murder. She's exactly like her mother, Dr. Winters snarled, moving to stop her. But William broke free from Thaddeus and intercepted him, sending the revolver skittering across the floor. Yes, William agreed, standing protectively in front of Margot. She is exactly like Sarah, and this time she'll finish what her mother started. The police burst into the room, weapons drawn. In the chaos of arrests and shouted commands, William heard something that made his heart stop, a single, clear voice calling from upstairs. Sarah Emily's voice, weak but unmistakable, carried down the grand staircase. Sarah's music. Dr. Winters's face went pale. Impossible. The dosage I gave her wasn't enough to silence the truth, William finished, watching as officers handcuffed the doctor. Thaddeus made one last desperate attempt to reach Margot, but William stood firm. The years of doubt, of wondering if he could have saved Sarah, of questioning whether he was betraying Emily by harboring her alleged poisoner's daughter, all of it crystallized into absolute certainty. You took Catherine from me, he said quietly to Dr. Winters as the police led him away. You poisoned my wife. You killed Sarah to protect your secrets. But you forgot something crucial: music always finds a way to be heard. In the aftermath, as police swarmed the mansion collecting evidence, William held Margot close, feeling her trembling slowly subside. Together, they watched Thaddeus and Dr. Winters being led away in handcuffs, their empire of secrets crumbling with each step. I wasn't sure at first, William admitted softly. When you came to my door that night, I was afraid of believing, afraid of hoping. But your mother was right, the truth was in the music all along. We just had to be brave enough to listen. In the quiet hours following the arrests, Emily Hayes's room became a sanctuary of hope. The medical equipment that had once seemed so oppressive now recorded a miracle in steady, strengthening rhythms. Emily's eyes, open and alert for the first time in 7 years, followed Margot's every movement as she sat at the small upright piano. "Play it again," Emily whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. "Sarah's last piece. I remember everything." William sat beside his wife's bed, holding her hand as Margot began to play. The melody flowed differently now, freed from its burden of hidden codes and secret messages. Yet within its notes lay a story that needed to be told. "She tried to warn me," Emily said, each word a triumph over years of enforced silence. That night before dinner, Sarah showed me the evidence. James Dr. Winters had been using the school to launder money from his experimental drug trials. Thaddeus handled the pharmaceuticals, made them disappear from inventory. Margot's fingers faltered on the keys for a moment, but Emily shook her head slightly. "Keep playing, dear. The music. It helps me remember." As the melody continued, Emily's voice grew stronger. They were testing drugs on terminal patients, falsifying results for pharmaceutical companies. The music school donations provided cover for the money. Sarah found the connection when she was teaching Catherine. William's grip on her hand tightened. Their daughter's name had been unspoken for so long. Catherine's illness, Emily continued, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't terminal. James was using her as a test subject. When Sarah discovered the truth, she knew she had to stop them. But they were ready for her. Margot played on, her mother's music giving strength to Emily's words. The truth, hidden for so long in melodies and rhythms, finally found its voice. "They meant to poison me slowly, make it look like a gradual decline, but something went wrong with the dosage that night. Sarah realized what was happening when I collapsed. She started to play this piece, her signal that she was about to expose everything. That's when Thaddeus." The music swelled, filling the room with its bittersweet testimony. Outside, the evening sun painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, as if nature itself were bearing witness to this moment of revelation. A team of new doctors had arrived, summoned by the police to evaluate Emily's condition. They stood amazed as their patient, supposedly locked in a near-vegetative state for 7 years, spoke with increasing clarity and purpose. The sedatives, one doctor explained in hushed tones to William. Dr. Winters was keeping her conscious but paralyzed. A sophisticated combination of drugs designed to trap her in her own body. But the music somehow helped her brain forge new neural pathways. Emily reached out, touching Margot's shoulder as she played. "You have her gift," she said softly. "Not just for music, but for truth. Sarah would be so proud." The piece ended, its final notes hanging in the air like a prayer. But for the first time, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with possibility, with healing, with justice too long delayed but finally served. "We'll need to document everything," William said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your testimony, the evidence Sarah gathered, all of it. But right now," he looked at his wife, really seeing her for the first time in 7 years. "Right now, we're just grateful to have you back." Emily smiled, then turned to Margot with determination in her eyes. "There's something else Sarah left for you. Something she entrusted to me the night everything happened. When I'm stronger," she glanced at William, who nodded encouragingly. "When I'm stronger, I'll show you where to find it." As night fell over the Hayes mansion, Margot began to play again, not her mother's pieces this time, but something new, something of her own. The melody spoke of loss and discovery, of silence and voice, of truth hidden in music and finally set free. Emily closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her, but her lips moved in silent words that only William could hear. "Sarah's daughter has come home." The police investigation uncovered layers of deception that stunned even the most seasoned detectives. In the harsh fluorescent light of the interrogation room, Thaddeus Anderson finally broke, his confession spilling out like poison from a long, festering wound. "It wasn't supposed to be Emily," he said, his voice hollow. "The poison was meant for Sarah. She was getting too close, asking too many questions." "Dr. Winters provided the compound untraceable," he said. "A gradual deterioration that would look natural." Detective Claire Morrison, who had originally investigated Sarah's death, watched through the one-way glass as Thaddeus described that fateful night. Each detail confirmed what Emily had remembered, adding new layers of horror to an already tragic story. "Sarah discovered our connection to the pharmaceutical trials too soon," Thaddeus continued. "She found the records of all the patients' terminal cases that weren't terminal at all. Kids like Catherine Hayes, used as test subjects for experimental drugs. The music school was perfect cover. Who would question generous donations from grateful parents? The evidence room filled with boxes of documents retrieved from Thaddeus's home. Hidden behind the attic walls, they found years of transaction records, correspondence with pharmaceutical companies, and lists of patients, each name representing a life destroyed by greed. Most damning was a small leather journal, its pages filled with Sarah's handwriting. She had documented everything: dates, times, conversations overheard. The final entry, written hours before her death, revealed the full scope of her discovery. "My dearest Margot," she had written, "if you're reading this, then what I feared has happened. The truth about Catherine's death cannot stay hidden. Emily and I will expose everything tonight. Thaddeus suspects, but he doesn't know about this journal. The evidence is in the music. Sweet girl. You'll understand when you're older. Remember, every song tells a story." William and Margot sat in Detective Morrison's office as she explained how Sarah's death had been staged. Thaddeus followed her that night, the detective said gently. When she tried to reach the police with evidence about Catherine's case, he caught her by the river. But it wasn't a simple murder. He wanted information. Security camera footage, long thought lost, showed Sarah's final moments. She stood at the riverbank, clutching her music sheets, refusing to reveal where she had hidden the proof of the drug trials. Even as Thaddeus approached, she began to hum her last composition, the piece containing the coded evidence. "Your mother died protecting you," Detective Morrison told Margot. "She knew if she revealed everything, they would come after you next, so she hid the truth in the one place they'd never think to look: in the music itself." The investigation revealed how Dr. Winters had altered Emily's medication after the poisoning, keeping her conscious but paralyzed to prevent her from exposing what she knew. The sophisticated cocktail of drugs had been designed to mimic a coma while leaving her aware of everything happening around her. "7 years," William whispered, his voice breaking. She heard and understood everything for 7 years, unable to move, unable to speak. While we grieved for Sarah, while we blamed her, Emily knew the truth and couldn't tell us. For Margot, each revelation about her mother brought both pain and pride. Sarah Anderson hadn't been a jealous protégé or a desperate criminal. She had been a hero, sacrificing everything to protect her daughter and expose a horrific truth. The evidence was irrefutable. Thaddeus and Dr. Winters had orchestrated not just Sarah's murder and Emily's poisoning, but years of medical exploitation hidden behind the respectable facade of the Hayes Music School. Their web of corruption had claimed countless lives, all in the name of profit. The truth about Sarah Anderson emerged like a symphony building to its crescendo. As the police investigation deepened, each new piece of evidence further illuminated her final days and the courage that had led to her death. Security footage recovered from the old music school showed Sarah working late into the night, meticulously documenting irregularities in the school's finances. She had discovered a pattern of donations coinciding with death's terminal patients whose conditions had mysteriously worsened after entering Dr. Winters' experimental treatment program. "Look at this," Detective Morrison said, spreading photographs across her desk. They showed Sarah secretly meeting with parents of deceased students, including Catherine Hayes' former classmates. She was building a case, gathering testimonies. She knew the risks, but she couldn't stand by and watch more children die. Emily, growing stronger each day, provided the missing pieces. Sarah came to me when she discovered Catherine's true medical records, she explained, her voice still weak but determined. Our daughter wasn't terminally ill. The experimental drugs had caused her decline. Sarah found similar cases, all children from wealthy families who had made substantial donations to the school. The most heartbreaking evidence came from Sarah's personal diary, found hidden in the base of Catherine's old music box. The final entries revealed a mother torn between exposing the truth and protecting her daughter. My dearest Margot sleeps peacefully, unaware that tomorrow everything will change. The evidence is clear now. Dr. Winters and Thaddeus have been using the school to fund their illegal drug trials. How many children have they killed? How many families have they destroyed? I can't stay silent, even though I know what they're capable of. Emily and I will end this tomorrow night. If anything happens to me, the proof is hidden where only Margot will think to look in the music itself. The night of her death was reconstructed through surveillance footage and witness statements. Sarah had arrived at the river to meet a journalist carrying a portfolio of evidence, but Thaddeus had followed her. The struggle was brief. Sarah had chosen to let go of the riverbank rather than surrender the documents that could protect future children. She didn't jump, Detective Morrison confirmed. Thaddeus grabbed for the portfolio, and Sarah, she made a choice. She knew if she lived, they would force her to reveal everything, putting Margot in danger. So she let go, taking her secrets to the river. But Sarah had planned for this possibility. The portfolio Thaddeus retrieved contained only part of the evidence. The rest she had encoded into her music complex patterns of notes that, when properly decoded, revealed dates, transactions, and names. Every piece she had taught in those final weeks contained part of the puzzle. The Riverside Memorial, once a place of shame for those who believed Sarah guilty, became a gathering place for families seeking justice. Parents whose children had been victims of the drug trials brought flowers and photos, sharing stories of how Sarah had tried to help them. For Margot, the truth about her mother brought both healing and heartache. She knew, she whispered, touching the piano keys that had carried her mother's final message. She knew they would kill her, but she kept teaching, kept playing, making sure the truth would survive. William placed the last piece of evidence on Detective Morrison's desk, a recording from Emily's room on the night of the poisoning. Sarah's voice could be heard, clear and determined. I won't let them hurt another child, Emily. Catherine deserved justice, and so do all the others. Whatever happens tonight, promise me you'll keep the music alive. It's all there, hidden in the notes, waiting for someone brave enough to play it. As Sarah's innocence came to light, the community's reaction was painfully mixed. Some rushed to express remorse for their years of judgment, while others doubled down, unable to face their role in perpetuating an innocent woman's persecution. At school, Margot faced a new kind of isolation. Students who had once simply ignored her now watched her with uncomfortable intensity, whispering behind their hands. Her mother was a hero, they'd say, but how do we know she's not seeking revenge? Mrs. Peterson, her mathematics teacher, who had always kept Margot seated at the back of the class, suddenly wanted her to share her unique perspective on everything. The artificial attention felt almost worse than the previous neglect. They're trying to rewrite history, William observed one evening, watching Margot pick at her dinner after another difficult day. It's easier for them to turn you into some kind of tragic figure than to admit they spent years punishing an innocent child. The local newspaper, which had once vilified Sarah, now wanted to run a feature story on Margot, daughter of fallen hero, seeks justice when she declined to be interviewed. They published speculation about her troubled emotional state and inability to process her mother's vindication. Even the music school, now under new management, attempted to capitalize on the situation. They proposed naming a scholarship after Sarah Anderson, but their press release somehow managed to take credit for nurturing the truth-seeking spirit that had led to her death. The worst came during a memorial service for the victims of Dr. Winter's drug trials. As Margot approached the podium to play one of her mother's pieces, a grieving parent stood up. "How dare you?" the woman cried out. "Your mother knew what was happening to our children, but she waited too long to act. My Tommy might be alive if she'd spoken up sooner." The silence that followed was deafening. Margot sat at the piano, her fingers hovering over the keys, feeling the weight of judgment from all sides. Then Emily Hayes, still weak but determined, wheeled herself to the front of the church. Sarah Anderson spent months gathering evidence to ensure that when she spoke, her words would bring justice, not just accusations, Emily declared, her voice carrying to every corner. She paid for that thoroughness with her life, and her daughter has paid with years of undeserved shame. If anyone here thinks they have the right to add to that burden, they can leave now. No one moved. Margot began to play, her mother's music filling the space with both accusation and forgiveness. In the notes, those who listened carefully could hear the story of a woman who chose truth over safety, justice over comfort, and ultimately her daughter's future over her own life. After the service, a small group of students approached Margot. Leading them was Jenny Phillips, who had once been her closest friend in kindergarten before her parents had forbidden the friendship. "We're sorry," Jenny said simply. "We didn't know, but we should have questioned. We should have been kinder." Margot looked at their faces, some genuinely remorseful, others still uncertain, and remembered something her mother had written in her final letter. "Truth doesn't always bring comfort, sweet girl, but it always brings clarity. Some will run from it, others will try to reshape it. But a few will stand firm and let it change them. Those are the ones worth waiting for." The full truth emerged on a quiet Sunday morning, when Emily Hayes finally regained enough strength to tell her complete story. The Hayes Mansion's music room, once a place of tragedy, became a chamber of revelation as Emily spoke, her voice growing stronger with each word. "It wasn't just Thaddeus and Jane," she began, sitting upright in her wheelchair by the grand piano. "There was someone else, someone whose name we never suspected." Her hands trembled as she reached for a hidden compartment beneath the piano's bench, removing a small diary bound in faded blue leather. Detective Morrison leaned forward, recording device at the ready, as Emily opened the diary to its final entry. The board chairman, Richard Maxwell, was the mastermind, she revealed. He approached James years ago, suggesting the music school as a perfect cover for their pharmaceutical testing. Rich families desperate for hope, willing to make substantial donations, it was the perfect scheme. William's face went pale. Richard Maxwell had been a pallbearer at Catherine's funeral, had consoled them in their grief, all while knowing the truth about their daughter's death. "He sat in our home," William whispered. "He watched us mourn, knowing he was responsible." Emily's hands shook as she continued. Sarah discovered the connection when she found Maxwell's signature on documents authorizing experimental treatments that weren't listed in any official medical records. "She showed me the evidence that afternoon, but someone overheard as Maxwell's secretary, Margaret Wells." The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Margaret Wells, who had organized every school event, who had served coffee at board meetings, who had access to every office and every file. She had been invisible, overlooked, the perfect spy. "Margaret was the one who switched the drinks," Emily said, her voice breaking. "She knew I always took my coffee the same way, always sat in the same chair. She made sure Sarah would be blamed, even planted evidence in Sarah's apartment while everyone was at the dinner party." Margot, who had been silent until now, moved to the piano. Her fingers found the keys that held her mother's last message, playing softly as Emily spoke. The melody seemed to give Emily strength, helping her piece together 7 years of trapped memories. "I saw Margaret do it," Emily continued. "But by the time I realized what was happening, the poison had already taken effect. I tried to speak, to warn Sarah, but my body was paralyzed. I could only watch as they destroyed her life, as they forced her into hiding, as they ultimately took her from us." Detective Morrison was already on her phone, dispatching officers to Margaret Wells's address. But Emily wasn't finished. From the diary she withdrew a micro SD card, carefully preserved between its pages. "Sarah gave me this the afternoon before the dinner party," she explained. "It contains everything surveillance footage from Maxwell's office, recorded conversations, bank transfers. She knew they might come for her, so she made sure the evidence would survive." The weight of the truth filled the room. Margaret Wells had been the perfect executor of Maxwell's plans, trusted, efficient, and utterly ruthless. She had orchestrated Sarah's downfall with meticulous precision, ensuring that all suspicion would fall on the dedicated music teacher who had dared to dig too deep. But Sarah was clever, Emily said, a hint of pride in her voice. She knew Margaret was watching her, so she hid her real evidence in the last place they'd think to look, in the music itself. Every piece she taught in those final weeks contained coded messages, building a case they couldn't destroy. As if in response, Margot's playing grew stronger, her mother's coded melody revealing its secrets to those who finally knew how to listen. The truth had been there all along, waiting in the spaces between notes, in the rhythm of justice long delayed but finally unleashed. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Detective Morrison's team discovered a hidden safe in Margaret Wells's basement. Inside, preserved with cruel precision, lay Sarah Anderson's final attempts to prevent the tragedy that would claim her life. A series of certified letters, dated in the weeks before Emily's poisoning, revealed Sarah's desperate attempts to alert authorities. She had written to the State Medical Board, the FDA, and even the FBI, documenting the suspicious deaths and questionable financial transactions. Each letter had been intercepted by Margaret, who had used her position to monitor all communication from the music school. "Look at this," Detective Morrison said, carefully unfolding a letter dated the morning of the fateful dinner party. Sarah knew exactly what they were planning. The letter, addressed to the district attorney, contained a detailed timeline of the pharmaceutical trials, including a warning about a planned demonstration of their newest drug's effectiveness. Security footage recovered from Margaret's files showed Sarah making one final attempt to prevent the crime. Hours before the dinner party, she had confronted Maxwell in his office, offering him a chance to confess and stop the operation. The footage, though silent, clearly showed Sarah placing a folder on Maxwell's desk, evidence that could have exposed everything. "She gave them a choice," Emily explained, watching the footage with tears in her eyes. She told Maxwell she would destroy the evidence if they would just stop the trials. She was willing to let them walk away, just to save future children from becoming test subjects. But Maxwell had simply smiled, appearing to agree while signaling Margaret through the office window. The secretary's efficient response was chilling within hours. She had manufactured evidence of Sarah's supposed jealousy and criminal intent, laying the groundwork for what would become the official narrative. Most heartbreaking were Sarah's personal notes, found hidden in her old teaching files. She had documented every child saved through her careful investigation, students quietly withdrawn from the trials after she warned their parents, families who escaped the scheme because she had intercepted their applications. "She saved dozens," William whispered, reading through the lists, all while knowing what it might cost her, all while never being able to tell anyone. A final USB drive, encrypted with a musical sequence that only Margot could unlock, contained Sarah's complete investigation. Video recordings, financial documents, and medical records proved not only her innocence, but her extraordinary courage. She had built her case methodically, knowing that one mistake would mean not just her death, but danger for everyone she was trying to protect. The last file was a video message, recorded the morning of the dinner party. Sarah, looking directly into the camera, spoke with quiet determination. "If you're watching this, then they've succeeded in silencing me. But they don't understand music can't be silenced. The truth is in the harmonies, in the rhythms, in the spaces between notes. My daughter will find it, and when she does, Let this evidence speak for those who no longer can. Detective Morrison assembled the timeline. Sarah had discovered the drug trials through Catherine's medical records, spent months gathering evidence, and finally recognized that Margaret was the key to the entire operation. On the day she died, she had tried one last time to stop them, not knowing that Margaret had already set her plan in motion. "Your mother wasn't just trying to expose them," Detective Morrison told Margot gently. "She was trying to give them a chance to stop voluntarily, to prevent more deaths. Even at the end, she chose compassion over vengeance." The evidence painted a portrait of a woman who had fought not for recognition or revenge, but simply to protect the innocent. Sarah Anderson had seen the truth, understood the cost of revealing it, and chosen to act anyway, leaving behind a legacy encoded in music, waiting for the moment when justice would finally play her unfinished symphony. In the stark confines of his prison cell, Thaddeus Anderson's facade finally crumbled. Detective Morrison found him sitting on his narrow bed, clutching a worn photograph of Sarah and young Margot at the piano. His confession, when it came, poured out like a long-suppressed symphony of guilt. "I loved her, you know," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah showed me a different kind of life, one with music, with purpose. But Maxwell had evidence of my past, of crimes I'd committed before meeting her. He owned me, and I let him use that power to destroy everything." As Thaddeus spoke, the full scope of his torment emerged. He had been caught between Maxwell's threats and Sarah's growing suspicions, watching helplessly as his wife pieced together the truth about the drug trials. His attempts to silence her had come from fear rather than malice, fear of what Maxwell would reveal, fear of losing the respectable life he'd built. The night by the river. He continued, tears now flowing freely. "I didn't mean to kill her. I just wanted the evidence. But Sarah, she looked at me with such disappointment, such sadness. She said, 'Thaddeus, our daughter will know the truth someday. Make sure you're ready to face it when she does.' The revelation that hit hardest came next. After Sarah died, Maxwell ordered me to destroy everything in her study. But I couldn't, not all of it. I kept her piano, her music sheets, hidden in that attic. Every time Margot played, every note that echoed through the house, it was Sarah's voice, reminding me of my cowardice." Detective Morrison presented him with Sarah's final letter, found among Margaret's possessions. In it, Sarah had written of her hope that Thaddeus would find the courage to break free from Maxwell's control, to protect their daughter from the truth until she was strong enough to bear it. "She knew," Thaddeus whispered, reading the letter with trembling hands. "She knew I was trapped, and still she believed I could change. I failed her. I failed Margot. I became exactly what Maxwell wanted, a broken man who would do anything to keep his secrets." His redemption began with a full confession, not just about Sarah's death, but about every aspect of Maxwell's operation. He provided names, dates, locations, details that would ensure no one escaped justice. But more importantly, he began to speak about Sarah's goodness, about the woman he had helped destroy. In a letter to Margot, delivered through William, Thaddeus wrote, "I cannot ask for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I can give you the truth about your mother. She was the bravest person I've ever known. She died protecting not just you, but every child who might have fallen victim to our crimes. Let her courage be your inheritance, not my shame." The final piece of his redemption came when he directed authorities to a safety deposit box containing Sarah's original research documents he had hidden away the night she died, unable to destroy them but too cowardly to use them. These papers, combined with the evidence Margaret had preserved, ensured that Maxwell and his entire network would face justice. "Your mother's music was always about saving lives," he told Margot during their final meeting. "I didn't understand that until now. She encoded the truth in melodies because she knew that someday someone would be brave enough to play them. That someone was you, Margot. You finished what she started." As he was led away to begin his sentence, Thaddeus stopped at the door. "There's one more thing," he said quietly. In the attic, behind the third beam, there's a package Sarah wrapped for your 8th birthday. She never got to give it to you. Maybe it's time you had it." The trial of Richard Maxwell and his co-conspirators became a watershed moment for the community. The courthouse, a stately building that had once condemned Sarah Anderson, now bore witness to the unraveling of decades of corruption. Maxwell sat stone-faced as prosecutor after prosecutor presented evidence of his crimes. Margaret Wells, seeking leniency, provided devastating testimony about the systematic abuse of trust and power. The evidence was overwhelming: forged documents, intercepted warnings, tampered medical records, a conspiracy that had claimed dozens of lives. But it was Emily Hayes's testimony that moved the jury to tears. From her wheelchair, she described the moment she realized she was being poisoned, the horror of watching Sarah's desperate attempt to save her, and the 7 years of conscious paralysis as she witnessed the destruction of an innocent woman's reputation. "Sarah Anderson didn't just try to save me," Emily declared, her voice carrying to every corner of the hushed courtroom. "She tried to save every child in that music school, and for that they murdered her, corrupted her memory, and forced her daughter to bear the weight of their crimes." The community's response began with the mayor's public apology on the steps of City Hall. "We failed Sarah Anderson," he announced, facing a sea of cameras. "We failed her daughter. We allowed prejudice and hasty judgment to blind us to the truth, and in doing so we became unwitting accomplices to a terrible injustice." But the music school, now under new management, established the Sarah Anderson Memorial Scholarship, genuinely this time, providing full tuition to students from underprivileged backgrounds. The school's main performance hall was renamed in her honor, with a plaque that told the true story of her sacrifice. Local newspapers published retractions of their previous coverage, accompanied by in-depth investigations into how they had allowed themselves to be manipulated by Maxwell's influence. The editor who had written the most damaging articles about Sarah personally apologized to Margot, offering her unlimited space to tell her mother's story. Former students of Sarah's came forward, sharing stories of her kindness, her dedication, and her subtle attempts to protect them. Parents spoke of mysterious phone calls warning them away from the experimental treatments, of scholarship offers that had saved their children from becoming test subjects. The verdicts, when they came, were unequivocal. Maxwell received multiple life sentences with no possibility of parole. Margaret Wells, despite her cooperation, was sentenced to 25 years. Other conspirators faced similar fates, their carefully constructed world of privilege and power crumbling under the weight of justice. But perhaps the most powerful moment came during the victim impact statements. Margot, sitting at a piano brought into the courtroom, played her mother's final composition, the piece that contained the coded evidence, now transformed into a testament of courage and love. As the last notes faded, she addressed the court. "My mother believed that truth, like music, cannot be silenced forever. She encoded her evidence in melodies because she knew that someday someone would listen carefully enough to hear it. Today we're all listening. Today." Justice plays her unfinished symphony. The judge, in his final remarks, ordered the creation of a special oversight committee for medical research named the Anderson Protocol, ensuring that no other children would fall victim to such exploitation. The committee's seal would feature a musical staff, a permanent reminder of how one teacher's courage had exposed a deadly conspiracy. Outside the courthouse, a spontaneous gathering formed. Students, teachers, parents, and community members held candles and sang a chorus of acknowledgement, remembrance, and promise. The music they chose was Sarah's favorite piece, its notes rising into the evening air like a prayer for healing, for justice, and for the power of truth to finally break its silenced bonds. The Hayes mansion underwent a transformation as profound as its inhabitants. Emily, growing stronger each day, moved her medical equipment from the isolated upstairs room to the sunlit music room, where Margot's daily practice sessions became a form of therapy for them both. William discovered a new purpose in fatherhood, channeling the love he'd held frozen since Catherine's death into nurturing Margot's talent and healing. He found himself leaving little notes in her music sheets, just as he had done for Catherine, and his heart swelled when Margot began leaving responses. "She would have loved you," Emily told Margot one afternoon as they sorted through Catherine's old music books. "You two are so alike, both stubborn, both brilliant, both with that same fire for justice." She pulled out a faded photograph of Catherine at her last recital. "We're not trying to replace her, sweetheart. We're just making room in our hearts for more love." The process of legal adoption began quietly, with paperwork filled out in William's study as winter turned to spring. But it was Margot who made it real, one morning at breakfast, when she looked up from her music theory homework and said simply, "Dad, could you help me with this passage?" William froze, toast halfway to his mouth, tears springing to his eyes. It was the first time she had called him that. Emily reached across the table, squeezing his hand as he found his voice. "Of course, sweetheart. Let's look at it together." The family's healing found its rhythm in shared moments, Emily teaching Margot the intricate fingering of Chopin's nocturnes, William helping her arrange her mother's compositions for publication. All three of them spending evenings in the garden as Margot practiced and fireflies danced around Emily's roses. Mrs. Mitchell, who had once viewed Margot with suspicion, became a fierce protector of their newfound happiness. She kept Sarah's recipes in regular rotation, teaching Margot to bake her mother's favorite cookies, sharing stories of the young teacher who had always made time to chat with the household staff. The attic, once a place of hidden secrets, was transformed into Margot's private studio. William installed proper lighting and heating, and Emily insisted on hanging Sarah's restored photographs alongside Catherine's. "This is your heritage," she told Margot. "Both of them, all of us, we're your family story now." On the day the adoption became final, they held a private ceremony in the music room. Margot played a piece she had composed, weaving together themes from Sarah's last work and Catherine's favorite melody. As the music filled the room, Emily and William exchanged rings with her simple silver bands engraved with musical notes. "Family isn't just about blood," William said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's about the music we make together, the truth we defend together, the love we choose to give each other every day." That night, as moonlight streamed through the windows, Margot found Emily alone in the music room, running her fingers over the piano keys. "I used to dream about this," Emily confessed. "During those silent years, I would imagine Sarah's daughter finding her way to us, healing our broken family. She knew, you know. Your mother knew that someday you'd need us as much as we'd need you." The final touch came when William hung a new portrait in the entrance hall, not a formal photograph, but a candid shot of the three of them at the piano, heads bent together over a piece of music, laughing at some shared joke. Beside it, he placed equal-sized photos of Sarah and Catherine. "This is what your mother fought for," he told Margot as they stood looking at the display. "Not just for justice, but for love, for family, for the chance for all of us to heal together." The final concert at the newly renamed Sarah Anderson Memorial Hall marked a turning point not just for Margot, but for the entire community. The program featured compositions from both Sarah and Catherine, interwoven with new pieces Margot had written about their shared story. Emily, now strong enough to sit at the piano again, joined Margot for a duet they had practiced in secret. Their performance of Legacy, a piece that combined Sarah's coded melody with themes from Catherine's unfinished final composition, left no dry eyes in the audience. William watched from the front row, his heart full as his wife and daughter created something beautiful from their collective loss. "Music has the power to heal what words cannot touch," Emily announced to the audience. Sarah Anderson understood this. She used music not just to hide truth, but to preserve love. Today we play not just in her memory, but in celebration of the family she helped create. The healing spread beyond the Hayes family. Former students established a foundation in Sarah's name, providing music therapy for traumatized children. The same community that had once shunned Margot now gathered regularly at the mansion for concerts where young musicians could perform without fear of judgment. Mrs. Mitchell turned the kitchen into a sanctuary where Margot could experiment with both music and baking, often combining the two. "Your mother used to say that recipes are just another kind of music," she told Margot. Both need precision, passion, and the courage to try something new. In the garden, William installed a special bench near Emily's roses, where Margot often practiced in the early morning light. The neighbors, who had once drawn their curtains at the sound of her playing, now opened their windows to let the music in. The most profound healing came during quiet moments, Emily and Margot playing piano duets late into the night, William teaching Margot to tend Catherine's memorial garden, all three of them sharing stories of Sarah and Catherine until the pain of loss transformed into the warmth of remembrance. On what would have been Sarah's birthday, they held a special concert. Margot premiered a composition called The Space Between Notes, dedicated to both her mothers, the one who had given her life and courage, and the one who had helped her find her voice again. "Mom always said that truth hides in the spaces between notes," Margot told the audience. "But that's where love lives too, in the pauses, in the silence, in the moments when we choose to listen carefully to each other's hearts." The mansion, once a place of secrets and silence, became filled with music at all hours. Students came for lessons, their laughter mixing with melodies. Emily continued to recover, her progress marked by increasingly complex pieces played with Margot. William found himself humming as he worked in his study, no longer haunted by memories but inspired by them. On quiet evenings, they would gather in the music room, Emily and William on the sofa, Margot at the piano. As she played, the photographs on the wall seemed to smile down at them, Sarah at her first recital, Catherine with her beloved sheet music, all the moments of joy that had led to this one. "We've created something beautiful," Emily said one such evening watching Margot play. "Not in spite of our losses, but because of them. Sarah would be proud of the family we've become." The final piece Margot played that night was new, a gentle lullaby that spoke of hope, of family found and love renewed. As the last notes faded, the silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the kind of peace that comes only after great struggle, the kind of love that builds itself from broken pieces into something stronger than before. In the garden, Sarah's roses bloomed alongside Catherine's favorites, different flowers creating a single beautiful garden. Like the family inside the mansion, they had found a way to grow together, their roots intertwined, their beauty made richer by their diversity. The music played on, a continuing testament to the power of truth, the strength of family, and the healing magic of love expressed through melody. Dear cherished viewers, your journey through this emotional story means everything to us. If this tale of healing, justice, and the unbreakable bonds of family touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments below. What moments moved you the most? Which character's journey resonated with you? Support our storytelling team by subscribing to our channel and liking this video. Every subscription helps us continue bringing these powerful narratives to life. Share this story with loved ones who might find comfort and hope in its message. Together, let's build a community that celebrates the power of love, music, and the triumph of truth. Your engagement makes these stories possible.